Hello, BookTube. I want to make an April 2023 TBR BY. This is my variation on the TBR, the to be read pile that's so popular on BookTube. My TBR BY is to be read by you, and it's a series of titles for a given month that I can recommend, that I have read. I've done a huge amount of reading in April releases so far. I still have a lot more to do, but I want to show you a few books that I can more or less in one way or another recommend. Some of them are wholesale recommendations. Those are rare so far in 2023. But all of them are thumbs up in one way or another. And the first one is something that we've seen a couple of times on this channel. This is by Peter Heather, and it's Christendom, The Triumph of a Religion. And this is a big, really stately, but still involving history of Christianity as it grew to take over the world. So you notice by the dates that this is not formative Christianity and all of its rival versions and splinters and shards and whatnot. This is more along the lines of a religion dominating states, or in the case of the papal states, a religion becoming a state. And it's really good. Just really, really good. If you like Christendom Destroyed, for instance, or David McCullough's Christendom, his huge book, this is another thing that's going to be right up your alley. It is a fascinating subject. Then we have another work of history. This is by the author of a history book that did well, so maybe you read The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. And this is his new book, The Earth Transformed, in which he looks at world history through the lens of climate, through the lens of ecology. How has that shaped world events? Maybe in ways that you have to be looking to see, and that if you are looking, you will see them. And at first, I was skeptical about that, but I really enjoyed this. I really did. It's more, I think, a lot more polemical than the author would readily agree. I think if I were to interview him and he were to say, and I were to say, this is mostly a Washington Post op-ed, he would probably strenuously object to that, but Simon Winchester would probably say the same thing about a lot of his books. That doesn't decrease its value for me at all. I thought it was incredibly thought-provoking. The impression you get here when you're reading this book is of whole populations moving to an unseen tune, to an unheard tune. Whole massive events of famine or feast that have climate at the back of them, no matter how much the front of them might be manipulated by kingdoms or economies or whatever. I thought that kind of thinking was fascinating. I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is that my initial impression here, before I read a word of it, was that it seemed a little pandering. But Frankopan makes it work. So, and in odd ways, in a couple of really good ways that I hadn't seen, and I'm glad that he did, he really elegantly dovetails it to the Silk Roads. So, it's going to make a good companion to that book. I can see both of them like in pretty UK trade paperbacks side by side. They will be good companions to each other. I guess what I'm saying is, if you read the first book, you'll like this one. Then we have a work of biography we've seen on this channel. This is by Sally Bedell Smith, who is an inveterate writer on the House of Windsor. And this is her big new book, George VI and Elizabeth, The Marriage That Saved the Monarchy. All very, very familiar ground. These stories, these anecdotes, everything about this has been written a million times in every Queen Mother biography, in every George VI biography, and there have also been a number of books about this particular marriage. But Sally Bedell Smith is a really good writer, and I don't ever require that books serve me up anything original. I really don't. It's all about the execution, and this is absorbing royal history. So if you saw it, and there's been a slew of Windsor-related history so far in 2023. We're going to see another example on this list. And there's a slew more to come. The gates have been opened by the death of Queen Elizabeth II, which still feels strange for me to say. I say that phrase, that term, and I still don't believe I'm really saying it. But the gates have been opened by that. But the key here to realize is that the archives have not been opened. So these things aren't going to be anything new. This is not anything new. If you've already read for instance, William Shawn's biography of the Queen Mother, or any of there are 2 or 3 really good biographies of George VI. If you've already read those, you're already going to know everything that's in here, especially if you've got a good memory for details and anecdotes. But Sally Bedell Smith does a really good job anyway. So this is definitely a recommend. Then we have a piece of nature. This is by Lixing Sun, and this is The Liars of Nature and the Nature of Liars, Cheating and Deception in the Living World. And that is not a dried leaf on the cover. Of course, that is an insect that has evolved to look like a dry leaf. And that this book is wonderful. It's full of examples like that of deceit in the natural world, which is not kind of a juxtaposition that we don't usually make. But there's no, without imputing any kind of anthropomorphizing, that evolution, that's the structure, the scheme behind that animal looking the way it does, is at heart deception. And there are lots and lots of animals in the world that do the same thing, whether they've evolved to look like something that they aren't, or whether they've developed a behavior that is meant to deceive other living things. And of course, humans aren't the only ones that do that. This is just, I thought that this was going to be predictable. I thought that this was going to be just a quick sort of yucky tour through the famous animal deceivers in the world, the lure fish and the trapdoor spider and whatnot. And it's much more than that. It's much, there is that is in here, but it's much closer to an examination of deception as an evolutionary priority. Oh, here we go. Can't miss that, can we? I really recommend it if you like nature books. Then we have, this is inevitable, we have another House of Windsor thing, and I can recommend it. It's not inevitable. I could have made this all about car manuals, but some of you might be interested in this. This is Giles Brandreth, who's done, like Sally Bedell Smith, a huge amount of writing about the House of Windsor. And this is his new book. It's Elizabeth, An Intimate Portrait. And there is a very nice picture of the late Queen. And the billing for this book, which made me, squint right away, is that it's an intimate portrait of Queen Elizabeth by someone who knew her well for a long, long time. And that's not exactly true. That's royal watchers and people who've talked to the monarch a couple of times, or maybe more than a couple of times, often bill themselves that way. But this also will be intensely familiar stuff, publicly reported, intensely familiar stuff. Those old larger size magazines of royalty and whatnot. I don't know if those still exist. They certainly don't seem to be published in America anymore. But if you were to read royalty magazine for 20 years and keep clippings and cross-index names and whatnot, you could write this book, which gently undercuts the selling material that says that this is something that by implication only a close insider could have written. That isn't true, but it doesn't matter. Again, just like with Sally Bedell Smith, it doesn't matter because Giles Brandreth is really good. It's really enjoyable as a writer. So if you are interested in this subject in the House of Windsor, these are major releases. There are probably 10 major releases coming out this year. Quite a few are out now or on the horizon for April and May. And this is one of them. This is a writer who has done a huge amount of work on House of Windsor. So then we'll go on the other end of the spectrum here. This is something for the gays. You got to have something for the gays. This is by Minerva Howe. I suspect that is a pseudonym. And this is, this has it all. This is Mist Dragon. This is book 1 in the Dragon Prophecies series. And like the Queen, we're dealing with a lovely smile. Only, unlike the Queen, at least I presume, we're also dealing with a dragon shapeshifter. This is the story of a young man who is a dragon shapeshifter, and he lives sort of up in the California hills with a bunch of other dragon shapeshifters. And this young man is obsessed with preserving dragon lore, digitizing it, saving it, studying it, learning its extent and whatnot. It's not pursued as much as I wish that Minerva Howe had pursued. I think that Minerva Howe was probably, I want to say, I know that I'm supposed to say she was probably in a hurry to get to down to the hot and steamy business, but if this book wasn't written by a man, I'm the czar of all the Russians. So I will go with Minerva Howe because that's the courteous thing to do, and I will say she. But I wish that the book had dwelt a little more on our main character's fascination with his own kind. But instead, we are introduced to the hunky love interest, who is also researching dragons, who is also interested in dragons. And when they meet, sparks fly, and soon other things are flying. And that's to the point, because this is yet another Omegaverse novel. This is yet another novel in which men can impregnate men, and then the impregnated man can have a baby. I am still wondering about a unified field theory treatment of the whole Omegaverse, how it works, how it came about, what its rules are, what its dimensions are. And horrifying, I mentioned that the other day in another video. And horrifyingly, one of you suggested in an email that maybe I should write that book. It's just a terrifying thought, especially because of how alluring it is to try and make sense of this. Of course, one element of the Omegaverse or that's what you call an mpreg. That's what that means, men pregnant. Part of the allure of why I would figure this out has nothing to do with the text of the books. It has to do with the psychology. What is the psychology here? Why is this wish fulfillment? I get, for instance, gay romance being wish fulfillment. I get that. A lot of people live in gay, inhospitable places. Even when they're in gay, hospitable places, a lot of men, especially young men, just don't have a lot in the way of self-confidence to ask the hunky dragon shifter if maybe they would like to go out for pizza or something like that. So that element of it is legitimate fantasy fulfillment. But the Omegaverse, that I don't get. That element, I would need to study that. I don't know all of the psychology behind why that would be appealing. Unless it's just to remove women from the whole of the universe of these gay fantasies. In a normal gay fantasy, just like in normal gay life, if a gay couple wants to have a child, they need to involve a woman. Maybe on some really deep atavistic level, the appeal of the Omegaverse is that isn't true. I don't know. I don't know. I'll figure it out. I'm not sure that a dragon shapeshifter would need a woman anyway. But this was delightful. Even so, is the point I'm trying to make. Sorry to get up into these psychological dark waters, but this is delightful. It was totally fun. If you're looking for a Omegaverse mpreg dragon shifter male on male gay romance, look no further. Then we have more fantasy. This is slightly more mainstream. This is Brent Weeks, who I absolutely love, and who, I want to point out, has never been seen in the same room with Brandon Sanderson. But this is his new book, Night Angel Nemesis, and like the Windsor books, this is intensely familiar stuff. Brent Weeks, much like Brandon Sanderson, has not, to my knowledge, ever trafficked in anything new or groundbreaking in his fantasy. Again, I don't mind. If you throw your energy into it, if you make it a great, terrific reading experience, this is a terrific reading experience, then I'm not going to care that I'm reading the whole thing and thinking, all right, this is all very familiar. And this is very familiar. This is the story of a battle-hardened old mercenary who thinks he's killed his last foe, but he has one last mission, at the behest/command of his friend/king. That is going to have you, if you're a reader of fantasy, or a watcher of fantasy on TV, that's going to have you thinking of a dozen things. It is extremely familiar as a sort of a plot outline. The whole point of this is going to be the execution, and Brent Weeks is a terrific writer, just terrific. So this was hugely enjoyable. Boring U.S. cover or no, it was hugely enjoyable. Then we'll do Library of America. This is a reprint series here in America. Beautiful thing. Rock solid, acid-free paper, so it stays crisp and white forever. Sewn binding, so the text block is not going to fall apart on you over the years. And minimal editorial intrusion, so that you're not going to have an introduction that dates after 40 years. You have almost nothing in the way of that. It just gives you the text. I usually recommend them. They are usually worth your time. This is one of the latest volumes, The Collected Works of Charles Portis. This is an author who will be overwhelmingly familiar to you all for True Grit, his novel True Grit, which is, I have a paperback of it, and it's terrific. It really does not dim with rereadings or with time. Some of you will be familiar with that novel mainly because it's been adapted twice, and both the adaptations were good, which is usually not the case, especially with modern Hollywood. But this collection has everything. The other writings naturally drew my attention because a lot of that stuff is stuff that's never been collected anywhere. But the thing that really got me, of course, I made my way through this whole book. It was a fast way through because I know a lot of this stuff. I've read everything by this author, except some of the other writings, the miscellaneous stuff that's collected here. But it was Masters of Atlantis that really got me this time. It's always a different thing when I read a Portis novel. He's very much worth you discovering if you haven't read him. And if you've only read True Grit, he's very much worth reading the rest of them. A lot of times that's not true. Brutal as it is. A lot of times you get a Library of America volume and it will be a famous author who's famous for one book. And there'll be a bunch of other books in there, and you'll read, if you're like me, you'll go through the book from beginning to end, and you'll think, okay, you were famous for only that one book, and I now see why. That is not the case with Portis, so I wanted to make sure that I recommended this. Then another author that just has never let me down is Curtis Sittenfeld. This is her new book, Romantic Comedy, which it has a kind of very intentionally, artificially zany plot on the surface. Two friends who, a man and woman are friends, and they are ordinary people. They are just ordinary people. But the man seems to have the ability to attract the attention, the friendship, even the relationship, the romantic interests of extremely beautiful people, to the point where they joke about it between themselves. And then it happens to the woman. And she gets to experience what it's like. And that's funny in a way, and Curtis Sittenfeld can be a very, very funny writer. That was an element. She wrote a terrific book called Rodham that I just love. The more I think about it, the higher I esteem it. And the thing that I regretted about Rodham when it got reviewed is that nobody seemed to realize how funny it was. And that's going to be harder to miss in this book, but there are deeper things going on here, and most of them have to do with the economy of physical attractiveness, which is pretty fascinating. We like to think now, we cynically say that it can be bought, that you can have a so-called makeover, but that only takes you so far. Some people are born or grow into a huge amount of this particular currency, and others just don't. And that is shrewdly analyzed in this book. I thought it was just a total success. Okay, this next one is not a total success. It was not the epic that I wanted it to be. But maybe my estimation will go up when I read the finished copy. I still thought it was tremendously impressive. And that is Dennis Lehane. This is his new book, Small Mercies. I don't want to block the bean there. And this is his Southie novel, which has been a long time brewing. It's existed in Little Tremors and Aftershocks in earlier books. What I mean by that, for those of you who aren't familiar with your Boston neighborhoods, for a long time in Boston, there was a neighborhood called South Boston. That was very different from the rest of Boston. Once upon a time, all the neighborhoods of Boston had very, very different personalities. That has largely stopped being true, except for the little Potemkin villages of, Little Italy or Chinatown or something like that. But once upon a time, it was organically true and overwhelmingly true. And for a long time, the regional identity, the character of South Boston was poor, hardscrabble, and Irish. And blight came to that South Boston in the form of organized crime and then the drugs that were brought in by organized crime. That destroyed that old Southie. And then gentrification came in and did the rest. So South Boston today, much like the other regional neighborhoods in Boston, has only a vestige of what it was, of it, the character, the nature that it once had. All the stories that unfolded on the little corners of those side streets with their little churches and their little schools. It was a whole world unto itself. And I was hoping that this book would be its War and Peace, and it isn't. But it's really, really good. It's not, I would say it's just about as good as The Given Day by Dennis Lehane. And naturally, it involves those two elements. One of the major characters is directly related to a crime boss of the type that came into Southie and flourished. They'd always been there. They'd been there since the Revolution, but small time. Not seeking to destroy a neighborhood, merely the parasite on the underside of a large animal, as opposed to a fatal disease, which is what they became in comparatively recent living memory, my living memory anyway. And this captures a lot of that really, really well. This Dennis Lehane is a serious writer. He is known for his kind of, I guess you could call them elaborate cop dramas. The people that made his reputation, that made his sales base, and a lot of people know him only for that. But when he does this, when he writes books like this, big serious novels, they're terrific. They're just absolutely terrific. I have a feeling that the reason that they don't tend to be considered that way, although the Times has been pretty open-minded about him lately, but I have a feeling the reason that they're not considered that way is because of that crime-oriented origin story. Should be kind of silly for the critical world, not that I'd put it past them. I love this. I thought it was really, really good, and it's possible that my estimation will go up that crucial extra 10% when I reread it. I will certainly reread it by the end of the year. But I can still wholeheartedly recommend it. Totally atmospheric and absorbing fiction read in a genre, fiction, that really doesn't have a lot of those. Right? And most fiction published in 2023 is going to be absolute garbage. Not just ineffective in parts, but worthless. Absolutely worthless. So when a writer is writing something that isn't that, that very much isn't that, I want to make sure you know about it. And this next one, you might certainly know about it. This is one of the most heralded books of all time. All of the batch of heralded books, most heralded books of all time, are all by the same author. And they are the aforementioned Brandon Sanderson. Or is it Brent Weeks? And this is Tress of the Emerald Sea. This is one of the COVID secret projects that Brandon Sanderson and his team worked on and kept under wraps. And they did a GoFundMe for this that made Brandon Sanderson an unbelievably wealthy man. Well north of $20 million, and that's without any kind of ancillary stuff at all. As I said on the late lamented Book of the Day podcast, that has to have a whole bunch of name recognition authors rethinking their contracts. what Brandon Sanderson gets to keep all of that money. The only amount of that $20-30 million that he is not keeping is the large amount that he is tithing to his church, but that's voluntary. The rest of it he gets to keep. Not 90% going to his publisher and the ad campaigns and the PR people and the distribution people and all that, just him. There are a handful of other writers out there. This had to have made them just feel a cold shiver down their spine. I'm thinking especially of Neil Gaiman. Why on earth would Neil Gaiman stick with a traditional publisher if this is possible? If he announced, my next 2 novels are in the works, they are mostly done, and I'm making a GoFundMe with different levels of incentive for different investors, he would make $300 million. Without a doubt. He would make a huge amount of money. And he must know that. But anyway, all of that was the news of this book and all of its sister books, almost totally eclipsing the book itself. And I read the book itself, this one anyway, and I can recommend it. I can definitely recommend it. Brandon Sanderson is not a hard author to recommend. He writes very companionable prose. It never pushes you. It's full of ideas. They aren't original ideas, but they are well thought out. They are well pursued. They're all fantasy instead of science fiction. Most of the time, they are fantasy instead of science fiction, but they are very circumscribed. This, for instance, is it's a very circumscribed story. There's nothing in this that will surprise you, but there's plenty in this that will delight you and that will interest you. There's no great prose anywhere in here, not even any prose in here that's terribly evocative. Most of it is, I don't want to use the word pedestrian because it's at a higher level than that. This guy definitely can write, but if we were to go to the foundational writers of science fiction, for instance, then you could see a comparison. I could draw a parallel that maybe would make it understandable, and that Brandon Sanderson is Arthur C. Clarke, not Ray Bradbury or Alfred Bester. There's nothing in here that's going to challenge you, but you will be delighted. And now you can experience it. This book, one of the books that the whole book world was talking about, it's obvious that aside from tithing to his church, Brandon Sanderson kept all of that money because certainly none of it went into cover design. I think Brandon Sanderson's one of his kids did this, but it's not bad at all. It's in fact very good. This is a TBR BY after all. If you're a reader of epic fantasy, you're going to read this anyway. I consider it minor Sanderson, but still worth your time to do, definitely. This next one, same thing, a bit of reserve. These books are a little bit over the map. These books are a little bit all over the map in terms of the strength of my recommendation. They all still get recommendations, but some recommendations will be stronger than others. And I'm waiting. I like, in the course of any year, to gather a small handful of recommendations, regardless of what kind of a book it is, that are the urgent kind you know already. You felt it yourself, where let's say you're walking through a retail bookstore with a friend and you encounter one of those books. You don't just want to point to it and say, this was really good, well worth your time. You want to actually shove it at them. You want to hand it to them, even offer to buy it for them. Those kinds of really urgent recommendations are what I live to make. Despite how critical I am of most books, I live to make those. Not all of these are that. And this next one is a tempered recommendation. We've seen it on this channel. This is by Philip Plait, and this is Under Alien Skies, a sightseer's guide to the universe. Note to book designers or insistent authors: don't put PhD on the cover, on the title of your book. Don't put PhD after your name. Okay. Just a free piece of advice there. When it comes to degree initials, the only degree initials that should go after your name on the title of your book are MD, not anything else. Okay, they hand out PhDs in Cracker Jack boxes, for Pete's sake. It makes you look grasping. But this is a fun, visually entertaining, there's all sorts of insets and graphics and whatnot, guide to what we know about Earth's solar systems. That is the huge preponderance of this book, despite the subtitle saying the universe. And then the local group and what we know about the exoplanets that have been discovered. Quite a bit. We know quite a bit about the thousands of exoplanets have been discovered, and we know a lot more about them than you would think. Educated guesses, but still. This is at its strongest when it's talking about Earth's solar system, and when it comes to a guided tour, an imaginary yacht, an imaginary cruiser is taking you on a tour of the solar system, and you get to go out in dinghies to these various locations. When it comes to that sort of thing, this too has been done many, many times before. This is an intensely familiar conceit. But once again, the author does it fairly well. In terms of a guided tour of, for instance, Earth's solar system, this is the best book that will appear this year. It will certainly keep you turning pages. It definitely counts as a recommend. You'll learn a lot unless you study the Earth's solar system as a hobby. You'll learn a lot. Of course, I should add one small disclaimer, which is that if you are like me, a NASA geek, an astronomy geek, if you do study everything that's known about our solar system in great detail, then parts of this book are going to irritate you. Parts of it are going to be you saying either that detail is almost wrong, it's so simple, or why are you concentrating on this element just because it's cinematic when the more interesting element is right next to you and you're barely mentioning it? You're just going to have to get, if you're, I don't imagine many people who read this book are going to be in that situation where they know all the details really well. If you know the maximum clocked speed of wind on Neptune, then this isn't the book for you anyway. If you know that, then and you read this anyway, you're going to be irritated by it almost as often as you are pleased by it. But that's not who this is for. And the audience that this is for is really going to enjoy it. We're going to wrap up here. Okay, this is a longer video than I thought. This next one is, again, a known author, a known quantity. And this author wrote Travelers in the Third Reich, which I read. We saw it on this channel. I loved it. I reviewed it for the Christian Science Monitor. I think I'm blurbed on the paperback. And this is Julia Boyd's new book, A Village in the Third Reich. And, oh boy, Travelers in the Third Reich was, at least in most of its part, about about the impressions that the Third Reich gave to visiting outsiders. There was a lot that wasn't that, but a lot of that book, the theme running through that book was the impression that the Third Reich gave to outsiders before it went to war, before it took its mask off. And that book can be haunting, and I've read a lot of other memoirs that are like that. People from all parts of the West and the United States who traveled in Hitler's Germany before World War II broke out. And so many of those travelers, they're traveling all around. They're in Austria, they're in Bavaria, they're in the Alps, and they're having a wonderful time. They're being, feted and joked with and enjoying the hospitality that the Germans of that age, of that pre-World War II era, did so well, just to make everybody feel so welcome and so happy. And yet, a lot of those travelers felt foreboding. There are at least half a dozen of them in memoirs that I have read, which means there are hundreds that I haven't read, who all reported the same thing, even though they didn't know each other. So they weren't comparing notes afterwards before their books went to publication, where they all felt the same thing when their car was leaving Hitler's Germany, when they passed the last checkpoint, with the guards they don't have their guns. They are smiling. They are merely checking your paperwork. That's all. At a normal border crossing, they are happy. They're hoping that you come back. They're patting your arm. They're saying, there's nobody behind you in line. Tell me, what were some of your favorite memories? The guards were saying all of those things. And yet, half a dozen people at least whose memoirs that I've read said that even though that was true, once they passed the checkpoint and were driving out of Hitler's Germany, they felt a huge relief, like they had been leaving some sort of cage and didn't know it. This book is inside that cage. This book is what was happening in those villages, in those towns, that was largely being hidden from those travelers in the Third Reich. This is a town that is gradually overrun by state ideology, by Nazi ideology. So the people who don't like it, well, they don't have their jobs anymore. They should maybe think about leaving town, maybe think about leaving the country if they're Jewish. And also, how Jewish? Okay, I've been living in this town. My family's been living in this town for 100 years. We're a staple part of the community. We all have friends. But why? So why are you asking me where my grandparents came from? People are starting to ask you that because it's starting to matter. And those shadows closing in all around this one town. Talk about chill down the spine. It's just superb. This author now has 2 fantastic books that I have read. This is a grim reading experience. You definitely have to be prepared for that ahead of time. But this has also been done before. There was a very famous book about 50 years ago that did this exact same thing. Told the story of what it was like for Nazism to engulf one particular city. But this is so much more intimate and just marvelously done. It's grim reading. You want to be prepared for that, but boy, oh boy, I strongly, strongly recommend it as an April release. And that's going to do it. That is an April 2023 TBR BY. So sorry to go on so long. I'm going to wrap this up. Those are just some books that I can, to one degree or another, recommend. I could do a lot more of these videos. Maybe at the end of the month we'll do another one. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. I'll be back, though. Thank you, BookTube.